A racist police officer unfairly attacks a black boy, the son of a powerful lawyer. A peaceful night, which should be a chance to have fun, turns into a nightmare. The square is full, the music livens up the local event. But all that joy and smiles disappear in an instant, when a white police officer, with a hard expression and a firm hand on his gun, walks through the crowd. He stops in front of the boy, stares at him for a second, and brutally pushes him to the ground. "You think you can do whatever you want around here?" The policeman's voice booms like thunder, cruel and violent. He doesn't ask, he accuses. He doesn't care. The boy, scared and in disbelief, tries to argue. "Sir, I didn't do anything. I was just listening to the music." But the police officer's response is even colder, more cruel. "I know very well what you do here. Everything is criminal, everything is thieves. Get those hands up, now." The people around watch, some in shock, others already accustomed to that type of scene. It's as if that young man wasn't a human being, just a threat to be eliminated. As if he didn't have a name, a life, a family, just a color. And while the boy is there, kneeling, with his hands on his head and eyes full of tears and fear, the police officer humiliates him. Throws him against the car, shouts false accusations, puts handcuffs on him. Insults are hurled mercilessly. "You don't belong here, you think you can come here and ruin everything? Who can act like he owns it? Not in my city." The crowd grows, but no one does anything. The boy feels the weight of every look, every word from the police officer, as if they were stones thrown at him. Injustice is suffocating. Your dignity, trampled. He is treated like a criminal when all he did was try to enjoy the night. It's like I'm living a nightmare, one that seems to have no end. But he's not just any boy. His father is one of the most influential and feared lawyers in the city of Oakland. A man known for his fierce dedication to justice and never losing a case. When he discovers what happened to his son, he feels a mix of pain, anger, and an uncontrollable desire for justice. He won't let it go. He knows the system inside and out, he knows how to manipulate the law in his favor. And, above all, he knows how to destroy a career, just like that police officer tried to destroy his son's life. From that moment on, the police officer's tranquility comes to an end. A simple abuse of authority, something he had done countless times before, now becomes his undoing. He doesn't know what's coming, he doesn't understand that he messed with the wrong person. The lawyer begins to move his pieces silently, with surgical precision. Make calls, gather evidence, talk to the right people. Every word spoken by the police officer that night becomes a weapon in the lawyer's hands, a tool to take down not just the man who hurt his son, but an entire corrupt and unjust system. Tension grows as the police officer continues his routine, unaware that his past is about to be exposed. He thinks he is untouchable, protected by his position and his uniform. But the truth is about to emerge, and the fall will be brutal. Because the lawyer isn't just seeking justice for his son, he's seeking revenge. Revenge against all prejudice, against all the pain that your son and so many others suffered. And when revenge comes, it will be swift, it will be shocking, and it will be public. The police officer will see his career, his reputation and his life crumble in front of everyone. Because messing with a powerful man's son is never just an act of racism, it's an invitation to one's own destruction. But how will this happen? How will justice be served? And, most importantly, how far is the father willing to go to ensure that that police officer pays for what he did? You're about to discover how the quest for justice can become an unrelenting force, and how far a person will go to protect the ones they love. Get ready, because this story will move you. The power of a family, the cruelty of a racist system, and a revenge that will forever change the lives of everyone involved. Will the racist police officer be able to escape? Or will you finally know the true meaning of justice? Follow until the end. You won't want to miss the end of this story. Hey, you who are watching now, I want to make it clear that the Plow of Twist channel repudiates any type of racism and discrimination. We know that prejudice is a difficult reality for many, and we want to say that we support you and your fight for equality and respect. This story is a portrait of overcoming in the desire for justice, because everyone deserves to be treated with dignity. Now, get ready for an impactful narrative, full of twists and turns and emotion. And if you like it, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any stories. Good story for you. Darnell was always a quiet, studious boy who liked sports and music. He grew up under the watchful care of his mother, a history teacher respected in the community, and his father, Charles Miller, a lawyer known in Oakland for his sharp wit and unparalleled ability to defend his clients. The Miller family never wasted, but lived comfortably. Darnell had a stable life, attended a good school and had the opportunity to experience things that his parents never had in their youth. Since he was little, his parents taught him the importance of being kind, respectful, but, above all, always fighting for his rights. Charles always said, "Never hang your head, son. Always be dignified, and remember that justice is on our side, even when the world seems wrong." However, living in Oakland, a vibrant city full of contrasts, also brought challenges. Even though Darnell lived in a quiet neighborhood, he knew all too well what it was like to be looked at suspiciously in stores and on streets, to be treated as suspicious for no reason at all. Even so, he kept his head high. His father, Charles, was a tireless supporter of civil rights and always guided Darnell to act calmly in conflict situations. "Racism will try to pull you down, son. Don't let that happen. You are much more than the view others have of you," said Charles, always looking directly into his son's eyes, transmitting strength and wisdom. Charles Miller, the lawyer, was a man of respect, with a firm stance and an authoritative voice. With a career built on defending victims of injustice, he had faced and won cases large and small. He knew well the intricacies of the law, the pitfalls of the system and the cruelty of prejudice. He had sat face to face with many judges and prosecutors who tried to undermine his chances of victory, but he always emerged triumphant. For Darnell, his father was more than a lawyer, he was an example of strength and courage. And he was very proud to have a father who helped so many people. That night, the city was especially lively. It was one of those community events where families got together, friends talked and, most importantly, young people could have fun. Music was playing on the speakers, food stands were scattered around the square, and Darnell, at 19 years old, felt free, relaxed. He was wearing a simple t-shirt, jeans and his favorite sneakers. "I was happy, that's all." It was a night that promised laughter, dancing, and the chance to be with friends, something he always valued. With all the problems of everyday life, those nights felt like a breather. And it was precisely there, in this apparently safe scenario, that the tranquility was broken. In the middle of the square, where Darnell and other young people were dancing to a lively beat, a man dressed in a police uniform walked forward with long strides. A tall man, imposing in appearance, with cold and suspicious eyes. His name was Peter Sullivan, a veteran police officer, known for his tough and often disrespectful manner. Sullivan was the kind of man who saw the world in black and white, and for him, black almost always meant trouble. He believed he was doing his job by maintaining order, and if that order meant humiliating black teenagers who were just trying to have fun, then that was what he would do. Darnell saw the officer approaching, but didn't care. After all, he wasn't doing anything wrong. Maybe it was just a normal patrol, like so many others that took place there. But when Sullivan walked over and grabbed him by the shoulder, Darnell felt the chill of tension run down his spine. The officer looked at him with a look full of prejudice, a look that Darnell had seen on other faces before, but never with such hostility. "You there, do you think you can come here and act like you rule the city?" Sullivan's voice was harsh, authoritative, full of contempt. Darnell tried to speak, to explain that he was just enjoying the music with his friends, that he wasn't doing anything wrong. But Sullivan wasn't interested in listening. "I know what you are. You are all the same. Bunch of delinquents, he shot, pushing Darnell back. It all happened so fast that Darnell barely had time to process what was happening. And, suddenly, the police officer forced him against the hood of a police car, brutally searching him. Where? Where did you hide the drugs? Where is what you stole? With each word, the humiliation grew more intense. Darnell could feel the gazes of people around him, some horrified, others apathetic. He wanted to scream, he wanted someone to say something, to defend his innocence. But no one moved. Sullivan continued with his accusations, ignoring any attempt at explanation. He had already decided that Darnell was guilty, and nothing the boy said would change his conviction. It was as if the only thing the police officer saw was the color of your skin, not your face, not your story, not your humanity. When Sullivan placed the handcuffs on Darnell, the boy's eyes burned with anger and helplessness. He didn't know what to do. Resisting would only make the situation worse, but remaining silent, accepting all that injustice, was like swallowing poison. The crowd, which now formed a circle around it, was divided. Some tried to intervene, begging the police officer to leave the boy alone. Others just murmured, saying that Darnell should calm down and obey. But how can he obey when the only thing he wants is justice? As Darnell was pushed into the squad car, his heart heavy and his eyes full of tears, one thing was clear to him: that night would change his life forever. And he had no idea that his father, the ruthless Charles Miller, was about to turn that humiliation into a personal battle. A battle where he would spare no effort to prove that no one, absolutely no one, could touch his son and get away with it. That night became a blur of mixed emotions for Darnell. The cold of the handcuffs against his wrists, the officer's look of contempt, and the whispers of the crowd around him were etched in his mind. Humiliation suffocated him every second, and the journey inside the vehicle was an endless nightmare. Sitting in the back seat, Darnell stared at the city lights whizzing by as he tried to understand how his night had turned into hell. He wanted to scream, wanted someone to hear, but his words caught in his throat. When they finally arrived at the police station, Sullivan roughly dragged him out of the car. There were no questions, nor any attempt at dialogue. He was thrown into a dirty cell, smelling of old metal and fear. Darnell tried to stay calm, remember his father's advice: never lose your temper, act with dignity. But how could he do that when everything around him said he was worthless? The wait was long, agonizing. Every minute seemed like an eternity, until a guard opened the cell and, without saying anything, took him to an interrogation room. Darnell felt small, vulnerable. Hours later, someone finally came to pick him up. His father, Charles, arrived accompanied by an assistant lawyer and an expression Darnell had never seen before: cold anger. It wasn't the uncontrolled, impulsive anger he saw in movies, but a calculated, dangerous anger. Charles barely exchanged words with the police officer who released him. He signed the papers, looked quickly at his son, and just said, "Let's go home, Darnell." The way back was silent. Darnell wanted to talk, but didn't know where to start. His head was full of questions, of shame, of fear. Charles, at the wheel, remained silent, his jaw tense, his hands firmly on the steering wheel. When they finally got home, Darnell's mother was waiting at the door. She ran to hug her son, full of worry and relief. "My baby, are you okay? What did they do to you?" Darnell hugged her tightly, trying to hide his tears. "I didn't want to worry my mother even more." But Charles was different. He remained still, observing, analyzing. And when the mother finally released her son, he said in a low, firm voice, "We need to talk." In the room, with everyone seated, Charles looked at Darnell with a penetrating gaze. "I want you to tell me exactly what happened. Every detail." Darnell began to speak, hesitantly, his voice shaking. He talked about the event, the music, his friends, and then, about how the police officer approached him. With each word, Charles seemed to grow more serious, more determined. He listened in silence, absorbing every detail, every sentence. When Darnell finished, Charles closed his eyes for a moment, breathing deeply, as if trying to contain something about to explode. "Son," he said, finally. "I'm going to fix this. I promise this officer will pay for what he did." Darnell, still trying to process everything, just nodded, not knowing what his father was planning. But his mother, who knew Charles better than anyone, was worried. "Charles, please, be careful. Don't let this situation consume you." He looked her in the eyes and replied firmly, "You know I won't let this go. No one touches my son like that and gets away with it." In the following days, Charles immersed himself in work. He wasn't just an ordinary lawyer, he was a strategist, someone who knew how to make the system work in his favor. His son's case became his top priority. He began investigating Officer Peter Sullivan, gathering evidence, talking to witnesses. But mostly, he started moving his pieces behind the scenes. He used contacts in the prosecutor's office, found friends in the local media and began to gather an arsenal of information that could destroy the police officer. Each time Charles sat down to review the evidence, his face grew darker, more determined. Meanwhile, Darnell was trying to get back into a routine. The school was a refuge, but also a place of curious eyes. Some students whispered, others asked too many questions. He knew the news had gotten out, but no one seemed to really understand what he had been through. His friends tried to support him, but even they didn't know what to say. "Man, I'm sorry about what happened, this cop is an asshole," one of them said, trying to console. Darnell forced a smile, but inside he was hurt, confused. All he wanted was to forget that night, but it seemed like the more he tried, the more that moment replayed in his mind, like a horror movie. A week later, Charles called Darnell into his home office. The room was full of papers, folders, documents. He turned to his son and said, "Darnell, I need you to know that what I'm going to do now isn't just for you. It's for all the kids like you who have been through this." Charles placed his hand on Darnell's shoulder, looking him in the eyes. "I'm going to turn this story into something big. This cop isn't going to hurt anyone else." And then the news came that would change everything. Charles received a call from one of his sources, a journalist he had known for years. "Charles, I have important information about Sullivan. It appears he has been accused of misconduct before, but the case was dismissed. I will investigate further, but you need to act quickly." Charles smiled to himself, a cold smile, as if he knew he was about to lay the first brick in someone's ruin. Meanwhile, Peter Sullivan continued his routine, arrogant, certain that he was above the law. He believed that incident would be nothing more than a note in his report, yet another, successful, approach. But, little by little, he began to notice different looks from his colleagues, comments cut in half as he passed by. The press was beginning to whisper about a possible abuse of power, and the police department was beginning to feel the pressure. The tension only grew. Charles worked tirelessly, and Darnell felt the weight of it all on his shoulders. Every day felt like a preparation for something bigger, something that was about to happen, but no one knew exactly what. And what was coming would be a blow so unexpected, so devastating, that it would leave the entire city in shock. But what was Charles planning? And how would he use everything he had to take down Sullivan? It was a gray afternoon when Darnell was called by his father to accompany him downtown. The boy didn't know exactly what was happening, but he felt in the air that something big was about to happen. Charles was visibly tense, his expression serious and determined as if he were about to go into battle. "Son, I want you to come with me today. It's going to be hard, but you need to be there," he said, looking Darnell in the eyes. Not fully understanding, Darnell nodded, knowing that if his father was asking for his presence, it was for something important. When they arrived at the building where the prosecutor's office was located, Darnell was impressed by the movement. Journalists with cameras, reporters frantically taking notes on notepads, intense murmurs. He felt butterflies in his stomach. He knew this was all connected to the night he was attacked by Peter Sullivan. But I still couldn't fully understand what was about to happen. Charles placed a firm hand on her shoulder. Darnell, today is the day we're going to start turning this story around. Trust me, okay? Inside the building, Charles walked confidently, greeting some people with a simple nod. He had a meeting scheduled with the county attorney, David Harris, a fair man but one who knew he was dealing with a smart and ruthless lawyer. In Harris's office, a stark, formal environment, the heavy curtains blocked out the sunlight and the air was thick, almost claustrophobic. Charles sat down, placing his leather briefcase firmly on the table, opening it slowly as the prosecutor watched intently. "Charles, I read your order," Harris began, trying to sound neutral. "But you know that opening a misconduct case against a veteran cop like Sullivan isn't simple. We need substantial evidence," and, before he could finish the sentence, Charles pulled a stack of documents, recordings, and photos from inside the briefcase and pushed them to the center of the table. "Here is the proof you need," he replied firmly. His tone was calm, but there was a fire in his eyes. Darnell, sitting nearby, watched silently. He had never seen his father so ruthless. Harris took the documents and began leafing through them. His face gradually changed as he analyzed the evidence. There were reports of other aggressive approaches by Sullivan, complaints from citizens, videos recorded by cell phone cameras showing the police officer attacking and insulting black people for no apparent reason. Charles had put together a complete dossier, and Harris realized there was no way to ignore this case. He sighed heavily, dropping the documents on the table and looking at Charles seriously. "You want me to destroy his career, is that it?" Charles smiled faintly, but it was a smile filled with anger and justice. "I want justice, David. Not just for Darnell, but for everyone else who was abused by this officer. You have the evidence there. You know what needs to be done." After hours of discussing the case, ironing out details and preparing the complaint, Harris finally agreed to open an official investigation against Sullivan. "I'll do my job, Charles. But I need you to know, when all this comes out, it's going to be a huge scandal. Are you prepared for what this could mean for your family, for Darnell?" Charles looked at his son, who was watching him with trusting eyes. "Darnell has been through the worst. Now it's time for us to face it together." The days that followed were a whirlwind. The story about Peter Sullivan's abuse of power made headlines. A photo of Darnell being pushed by the police officer made the front page of local newspapers, and social media exploded with discussions about racism, police abuse and justice. The pressure on the Oakland Police Department was growing by the second. And while most people expressed support for Darnell and his family, there were those who tried to defend Sullivan, saying he was just a cop doing his job. But the narrative was reversing. Sullivan's image, which had previously been seen as a defender of order, began to crumble. Darnell watched all this with mixed feelings. On the one hand, he was grateful to finally see justice move in his favor. But on the other hand, he felt exposed, vulnerable. His schoolmates whispered when he passed, teachers tried to avoid direct gazes, and even close friends didn't know how to act around him. "Man, I'm so sorry this is happening," said one friend, head down. "It's so crazy seeing your picture everywhere." Darnell just waved, pretending to be okay, but inside, he still carried the weight of that night. Meanwhile, Peter Sullivan felt the pressure mounting. At the police station, the looks of colleagues were different, suspicious, cold. When he entered a room, conversations would stop, and whispers would take over. He knew his career was at risk, but he refused to believe it was about to fall. "I'm a police officer. I keep this city safe," he shouted to himself, as if repeating those words would stop what was to come. The situation came to a head when Sullivan was called to the police chief's office, a large room with glass windows overlooking the city. The boss, a man with a serious posture and little tolerance for scandals, was sitting behind his desk, hands clasped, a heavy expression on his face. "Sullivan, you know why you're here." Sullivan straightened up, trying to maintain his confident posture. Look, boss, I was just doing my job. I can't be punished for doing my job. The boss slowly got up, walking to the window. We have a problem, Sullivan. The charges against you are serious, and the prosecutor is pushing for an immediate suspension while the investigation proceeds. I can't protect you anymore. The boss's voice was low, but the authority was clear. Sullivan felt the blood rush to his face. This is absurd. All because of a boy who was causing trouble. I can't believe you guys will give in to this. The boss turned, eyes fixed on Sullivan's. This kid wasn't causing any trouble, and you know it. Now, do what's right. Hand over your badge and your gun. Sullivan was silent in disbelief. He had spent years of his life serving at that police station, he considered himself untouchable. Now here he was, being forced to hand over everything he had built. That's unfair, he muttered, as he handed his badge and gun to his boss with shaking hands. Meanwhile, outside, Charles and Darnell were standing anxiously waiting. When they saw Sullivan exit the building, now out of uniform and with his shoulders slumped, there was a moment of heavy silence. Sullivan looked at Charles and Darnell with deep hatred, but this time he had no words to hurl at them. He walked past them without saying anything, his face burning with embarrassment. Darnell finally felt like he could breathe. That man who treated him like nothing, who made him feel fear and powerlessness, now stood before him unarmed, powerless. He didn't know exactly what he was feeling, whether it was justice, revenge or a mix of both. But she knew that, for the first time since that night, he felt a hint of relief. But Charles wasn't finished. He had more tricks up his sleeve, something that would still leave everyone in shock. As Darnell looked at his father in silence, Charles approached, placing his hand on his shoulder again. Son, this is just the beginning. Tomorrow, everyone will know exactly who Peter Sullivan is. And it was true. The next day, a press conference was held in Oakland Central Square. Charles, alongside Darnell and other lawyers, stood in front of cameras, reporters, and a crowd that had gathered to hear what he had to say. Today we are not just here to talk about an incident of racism. We are here to expose a pattern, a systematic abuse of power. Peter Sullivan isn't just a cop. He is a symbol of the racism that corrupts our institutions, and we will no longer remain silent. Darnell, watching everything, felt a weight lift off his shoulders. For the first time, he knew his story had been heard. And what began as a night of humiliation had now turned into an unwavering quest for justice. But what Charles revealed next, the story he was about to tell, was something no one could have predicted. The silence of the crowd in the Oakland Square was palpable. Charles Miller, with a firm stance and a voice that carried authority and indignation, had all eyes on him. The television cameras were live, and Darnell's face was there too, in the front row, looking at his father with a mixture of pride and anxiety. As the press and community waited to hear what else Charles had to say, Darnell looked around, feeling a strange tension in the air. It was as if the entire city was holding its breath, waiting for the next move in this game of justice and revenge. You all know what happened to my son, Charles began, his voice echoing through the speakers. But this isn't just about a single night. It's not just about a police officer assaulting an innocent boy. It's about a pattern of behavior that can no longer be ignored. Peter Sullivan abused his power not just once, but multiple times throughout his career. Today, I have an obligation to show the world who he really is. Charles paused, his eyes scanning the crowd, taking in the expressions of support, curiosity, and outrage. He then took out a stack of documents from his briefcase. Here, he said, holding up the papers, are records that prove that Peter Sullivan has been accused of misconduct by other young black men. Reports of abuse, unnecessary force, overt racism, they have all been filed away, ignored by the police department of Oakland. The system failed my son, and all these other young people. Charles's words hung in the air like lead, and Darnell felt the anger and hope mixed in the looks of those around him. He didn't know what else his father was about to reveal, but he felt like it would change Sullivan's life forever. It was then that, suddenly, a scream interrupted the tension in the square. "That's a lie." The voice, strong and desperate, came from Sullivan, who was there in the crowd, trying to push the reporters closer. The officer's face was red, his hands were shaking with rage, and he seemed on the verge of losing control. "You don't know what you're talking about, Miller. This is all a hoax." Charles remained calm, watching Sullivan like a predator watches its prey. "I wouldn't lie about something like that. All of these documents were carefully collected. Everything here is true, Sullivan, and you know it." The crowd began to murmur, a growing agitation that reflected the shock and outrage at what they were hearing. Sullivan, now in front of Charles and Darnell, was panting, his expression brimming with hatred and despair. "You think you can destroy me like that? You think you can tarnish my career? I've served this city for years. I keep these streets safe. And you, boy," he said, pointing a trembling finger at Darnell, "you know you were wrong that night. You were causing trouble. You deserved what happened." Darnell looked at Sullivan, feeling his blood boil in his veins. For a second, all the trauma of that night came back, the feeling of being treated like a criminal, of being thrown to the ground as if it were nothing. But before he could respond, Charles intervened. "My son did nothing wrong, Sullivan. You abused your power because you thought you could get away with it. Because you thought no one would care about a black kid's word against yours." Charles turned to the crowd, raising his voice. "But that narrative ends here. And today, we demand justice." The crowd began to applaud and shout words of support. Darnell watched everything with wide eyes. "I had never felt anything like this, a feeling of power, of seeing your voice finally being heard." But he also saw the fury on Sullivan's face, who now looked like a man about to lose everything. The officer approached Charles, the two coming face to face. "You're going to regret this, Miller," Sullivan whispered through clenched teeth. "I'm still a cop. I still have contacts. You can't take me out like that." Charles stepped forward, standing just inches from Sullivan. "I'm not breaking you, Sullivan. You did this alone. All I'm doing is bringing the truth to light." The crowd was in complete turmoil. Some started shouting, "Justice for Darnell," while others filmed every detail of that confrontation. The tension was palpable, and Darnell could feel his heart pounding in his chest. Suddenly, Charles raised his hand, asking the crowd for silence. "I know many of you are angry. I know many of you are tired of this injustice. But justice is not about anger. It's about truth. It's about holding accountable those who abuse their power." He looked at Darnell, his gaze full of strength and determination. "And it's about protecting our children. About ensuring they grow up in a world where their color doesn't define them, where they can walk freely without fear." Sullivan tried to respond, but the words seemed to escape his mouth. He was helpless, knowing that his entire past was being exposed there, in front of everyone. He tried to turn around, flee the square, but the crowd surrounded him, journalists asked questions, camera flashes exploded around him. Darnell felt, for the first time, that Sullivan was getting a taste of his own medicine, the feeling of being surrounded, judged, powerless. It was a bitter and powerful irony. As Sullivan struggled to extricate himself from the crowd and the storm of questions, Charles struck the final blow. He took a final document from his briefcase and showed it to the crowd. "Here is the final proof that Peter Sullivan should never have been a police officer." He handed the paper to a reporter, who read aloud, "Certificate of Misconduct, signed by the Oakland Police Department's Disciplinary Tribunal, recommending the dismissal of Sullivan for excessive force, even before he assaulted Darnell." The revelation fell like a bombshell, and Darnell felt a wave of shock go through the crowd. Sullivan was finished. It was the end of his career, the end of his reputation. Sullivan looked at Charles, defeated, hatred and fear written all over his face. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. He knew it was over, knew that everything he had built was crumbling before his eyes. "You destroyed me, Miller," he said, almost in a whisper, angry tears filling his eyes. "You destroyed everything." Charles stepped forward, coming face to face with Sullivan. "You destroyed yourself, Sullivan. It was never about me or my son. It was about you, your choices, and the price you are now paying." The crowd was completely silent, as if every person there was holding their breath, waiting for the next move. Sullivan, in a last desperate act, tried to attack Charles, but was quickly restrained by police officers who were now there to arrest their former colleague. As Sullivan was handcuffed and led out of the square, Darnell watched with a mix of emotions: relief, sadness, justice. This man who humiliated him, who tried to destroy his dignity, was now being dragged away, helpless, the same way Darnell had been dragged to the police station that night. The boy looked at his father, who wrapped him in a strong hug. "This won't erase what happened, son," Charles said, his voice thick with emotion. "But today, you proved that you will not be defined by anyone's cruelty. You are much stronger than that." Darnell closed his eyes, feeling the warmth of that hug, the weight of everything they had experienced together. And he knew that, despite everything they suffered, they had won. Finally, justice had been served. But there was still one last question: what would come next? The battle was won, but the war against racism and injustice was far from over. And that day, in downtown Oakland, was just the beginning of something much bigger. Oakland Central Square continued to be filled with the sound of arguments and commotion caused by that morning's explosive events. Sullivan had been taken away by the authorities, now he was just another face lost in the crowd, carried away by the very system he so believed he had control over. Charles Miller was still standing next to Darnell, feeling the weight of that battle fought and won. But that victory brought with it new consequences, open wounds, a conflict that was far from over. The following days were a roller coaster of emotions. The press wouldn't leave Darnell alone, they wanted to know more about his life, about his father, about what he felt that fateful night and what he was feeling now that justice finally seemed to be being served. Darnell, for his part, wavered between a feeling of relief and a new layer of tension that he didn't quite know how to manage. He became a symbol of sorts, a voice for all young black men who suffered from police abuse. But it also meant that his every step was under scrutiny. His image was in the newspapers, on television, on social media. One night, Charles and Darnell were sitting together in the kitchen, something that had become a custom since everything started to blow up. "Dad, will this ever end?" Darnell asked, looking into his teacup as if searching for answers there. Charles sighed, searching for words to comfort his son. "I know it's hard, son. I know you wanted to move on, forget everything. But sometimes, fighting for what's right means carrying the weight of that fight for longer than we'd like." Darnell nodded, but the weariness was visible in his eyes. "I just wanted to be normal again, you know. Not to be, this person that everyone looks at all the time." Charles knew there was no easy answer to that. He also felt exhausted, pressured from all sides. People approached him on the street, thanking him for his courage, but there were also those who blamed him, who said he was ruining the life of a good police officer. Even among his fellow lawyers, the division was clear: some congratulated him for being so brave, others just looked at him from the corner of their eye, as if he had crossed a line that no one should cross. He wanted to protect Darnell from all this pressure, but he knew it was impossible. Their fight was now public, and they had to remain firm. The next day, Charles was called to a meeting at Prosecutor David Harris's office. He expected a formal discussion about the progress of the case, but upon entering the room, he noticed that the atmosphere was different, colder, tense. Harris was sitting, leafing through a file, and his expression looked tired. "Charles, I need to speak to you frankly," Harris began, without looking up from his papers. "The exposure of this case was gigantic. You know how much this is affecting the police department, the entire city. The pressure is immense, and everyone is on top of me to get this resolved, quickly." Charles walked over, sitting across from Harris. I understand the pressure, David. But justice is not a matter of convenience. We will not remain silent just because it is uncomfortable for some. Harris finally looked up, and Charles realized he was feeling cornered. It's not just about discomfort. It's about maintaining some stability in the city. And now Sullivan is making a plea to be reinstated to his position while the investigation is ongoing. The shock ran through Charles's body like an electric current. You're kidding me, right? He leaned forward, eyes fixed on Harris's. This man was exposed, he assaulted my son and many others. Do you really believe reinstating him is the right path? I'm not saying it's right, Harris said, raising his hands as if trying to protect himself. But there is political pressure. And, Charles, this isn't just up to me. The police union is involved, and they're moving in full force. They claim Sullivan is being unfairly treated because of all the media attention and because he's a white cop being accused by a black family, Charles interrupted, feeling anger rising within him. That's what it's all about, isn't it? They think they can circumvent justice and make Sullivan a victim. Harris looked away, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. I just need you to know that the path isn't going to be as easy as it seems. Charles stood up, his figure looking stronger and more determined than ever. It's never been easy, David. But I won't give up now. And if you truly believe in justice, you won't leave me alone in this fight. As Charles left Harris's office, he felt the weight of that battle growing even more heavily on his shoulders. He knew that Sullivan wouldn't go down without a fight, that those who wanted to keep him in his position would do everything they could to change the narrative. And he knew that the war he would fight from then on would be even more difficult, with more twists and turns and dilemmas than he could ever imagine. Across town, Darnell was also facing his own battles. At school, he became the center of attention, and not in the way he wanted. Many supported him, but there were those who accused him of taking advantage of the situation. A group of students, children of police officers and fervent supporters of the corporation, began to confront him in the hallways. Hey, Darnell, you think you're the hometown hero now, huh? What's it like knowing you ruined the life of a man who was doing his job? Darnell tried to ignore it, but each comment was a stab at his spirits. On one of these days, Darnell was in the cafeteria, trying to eat in silence, when one of these students came up to him and, without saying anything, overturned his tray of food, scattering it all over the floor. Now you know what it's like to be treated like dirt, said the boy, with a smirk. Darnell, trying to remain calm, bent down to clean up the mess, but his mind was racing. He wanted to respond, he wanted to fight, but he knew that if he did, the entire narrative would be skewed against him. He would be the aggressive young black man they wanted to paint from the beginning. But a feeling was growing inside him. A determination he still couldn't explain. He knew he couldn't let Sullivan, and everyone who supported him, win this battle. When he arrived home that night, exhausted and shaken, he found his father in the office, reviewing documents and talking on the phone. Charles looked at his son and saw the expression on his face. What happened, Darnell? He asked, putting down the phone and moving closer. Darnell talked about school, about the confrontations, about how difficult it was to carry this weight alone. Charles pulled him into a tight hug. I know it's hard, son. But you're stronger than that. They're trying to break us, to silence us. But we can't let them do that. Darnell nodded, feeling tears burning his eyes, but he held them back. He knew that no matter how long this took, he had to stand firm by his father's side. And then, something unexpected happened. One morning, Charles received an envelope in the mail, with no return address, with nothing written on it other than his name. Inside were documents he hadn't expected to see, internal police department correspondence, evidence of how Sullivan and other officers had conspired to hide their actions, manipulate reports, and protect each other. It was the missing piece, proof that it wasn't just one racist police officer, but an entire corrupt system that needed to be overthrown. Charles looked at Darnell, who was standing next to him, and smiled for the first time in a long time. "I think someone up there is finally looking out for us," he said, as Darnell sorted through the papers in his hands. "We have a chance to end this once and for all, son. To get real justice." Darnell felt a new spark of hope within him. They were finally close to ending that cycle of injustice and abuse. But at the same time, he knew that this new revelation would bring even more enemies, more problems, and more fights. He looked at his father, seeing a reflection of himself, a man willing to fight to the end, without bowing to pressure or fear. And he was ready for whatever came next. Because this battle, despite being exhausting and painful, was not yet won. But they were stronger than ever. And now, with the truth on their side, they were ready to face whatever came. With the documents in hand, Charles knew he was about to take down not just Sullivan, but an entire system of corruption and racism that permeated the Oakland Police Department. Darnell watched his father in awe, a man determined to not only protect his family, but also fight for what was right for everyone. And, contrary to everything the young man felt throughout this journey, this time he was not afraid, he was prepared. The decision was quick. Charles took the evidence to Prosecutor Harris, who, faced with such concrete evidence, had no choice but to act immediately. An investigation was opened not only against Peter Sullivan, but against several officers involved in abusive practices and covering up crimes. The news spread like wildfire, and Oakland saw a true revolution within its police force. Corrupt officers were removed, suspensions were handed out, and Sullivan, who was still trying to maintain his innocence, saw his world come crashing down once and for all. The case reached the court, and the room was packed, journalists, activists, and ordinary citizens, all waiting to see the downfall of Sullivan and all who had committed atrocities under the guise of protect and serve. During the trial, Darnell was called to testify. When he took the witness stand, he maintained a firm posture, with his head held high. For the first time, he was speaking as a voice that represented not only himself, but everyone who had ever been unfairly treated because of their color or origin. "I didn't want to be here today," Darnell said, his voice clear and determined. "But I can't let others go through what I went through. No one deserves to be treated as less, no one deserves to be humiliated for simply existing. I am here to demand justice, and to let everyone know that the truth always finds a way to come out." Sullivan, sitting across the room, looked like a defeated man. His gaze was no longer that of an arrogant aggressor, it was that of someone who knew the end was near. With each testimony, with each new piece of evidence presented, the weight of his actions became more evident. And when it came time to hear the verdict, the room was dead silent, everyone waiting for the final moment. The judge, his voice deep and solemn, declared Sullivan guilty of assault, abuse of power, and engaging in corrupt practices to cover up his crimes. He was sentenced to a long sentence, his career ruined forever. As he was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, Darnell looked at him one last time. There was no hate in his eyes, just a sense of justice, that things were finally where they should be. The Oakland Police Department has undergone a major overhaul. The police chief resigned, and new leadership was installed, committed to transparency and fairness for all citizens. And while the city still faced many challenges, Darnell's case became a symbol of change, courage and hope for all who have suffered from abuse and discrimination. Charles and Darnell, for their part, left the courtroom that day with a sense of relief they hadn't felt in a long time. They had fought together, and they had won. Darnell, now 18, was about to graduate from high school and was preparing to enter college, something he could do with a new worldview, stronger, more aware of his power. "I'm proud of you, son," Charles said, hugging him. "You faced all of this head-on, and never let it break you." Darnell smiled, feeling the strength of that hug, but also the freedom of knowing that the worst was over. "You always taught me to fight for what's right, Dad. Now I know what that really means." Darnell and Charles's story is about struggle, resistance, and, most of all, justice. It's about not lowering your head in the face of injustice, even when everything seems to be against you. This story shows that, even in situations of pain and humiliation, there is still room for courage and the search for a more just world. But what about you? Have you ever been in a situation where you felt like you had to fight for what is right? Or do you know someone who has had to face something similar? Share your story or your opinion about what Darnell and Charles went through in the comments. Here at Tales of Twist, we bring exciting narratives, stories of overcoming twists and turns that inspire and make you reflect. If you liked this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave your like and activate the bell so you don't miss the next stories that will move you and keep you captivated from beginning to end. Thank you for being here with us today. Until next time.